Did you know your great-grandmother might have served you dishes that would land her in court today? I'm talking about foods that were perfectly normal on British tables just a century ago, but are now completely illegal to serve, sell, or even possess. We're taking a trip down memory lane to discover how dramatically our food laws have changed. From songbirds that graced Sunday dinner tables to government-promoted whale steaks, these weren't exotic curiosities. They were everyday British fare that would now result in hefty fines or prison sentences. Today, we'll explore the shocking transformation from common kitchen staples to banned substances and discover just how different our great-grandparents' world really was. The birds that now fill our gardens with song were once filling British dinner plates. Thrushes, blackbirds, and larks weren't exotic delicacies reserved for the wealthy. They were everyday protein, as common on working-class tables as chicken is today. Skylark pie was particularly prized eating. The very birds whose song was the soundtrack of the British countryside became the centrepiece of Sunday roast. Housewives would spend autumn afternoons cleaning dozens of small birds, preparing them whole for deep pies layered with herbs and onions. The preparation was quite an art, passed down through generations of country cooks. The meat itself was nothing like today's bland, pale chicken. These wild birds offered dark, rich, intensely flavoured flesh with a gamey taste that spoke of the hedgerows and fields where they'd lived. Each species brought its own character to the table. Thrushes were meaty and substantial, while larks were delicate but packed with flavour. But it wasn't just the small songbirds. Larger game birds that we now consider protected were equally common fare. What we call conservation, our ancestors called waste. Every bird that could be caught was potential protein, and rural families developed sophisticated methods for trapping and preparing them. The cultural shift began slowly but accelerated dramatically with the Wildlife and Countryside Act of 1981. This legislation didn't just regulate hunting, it fundamentally redefined our relationship with British wildlife. Almost every songbird you can name became a protected species overnight. Today, killing a single thrush for your dinner would violate multiple laws and could result in a fine of £5,000 per bird. Your robin redbreast pecking at breadcrumbs outside your window is now worth more than your car in legal terms. The penalties are so severe that even accidentally harming protected birds can land you in serious trouble. The transformation represents more than just changing laws. It reflects a complete cultural shift from viewing wildlife as a practical food source to seeing it as something sacred that must be preserved. Rural communities that had maintained traditional relationships with wild birds for centuries found their ancestral knowledge suddenly criminalized. What makes this change particularly poignant is how it severed the connection between ordinary people and the natural world around them. In the 1920s, a country child would learn to identify birds not just by their songs, but by their taste and the best methods for catching them. That knowledge, passed down through countless generations, vanished within a single lifetime. The enforcement of these new protections was swift and comprehensive. Traditional practices like snaring and netting were either banned outright or so heavily regulated that they became effectively prohibited. What was once common knowledge shared throughout rural communities became specialized expertise available only to licensed professionals. For many older Britons, the memory of songbird dishes represents a lost world where nothing was wasted and every creature had its purpose. The idea that a blackbird might sing its entire life without ever fulfilling what their grandparents would have seen as its ultimate destiny seems almost wasteful. Yet the results of this protection have been remarkable. Bird populations that were declining under hunting pressure have recovered. The dawn chorus that fills our mornings is richer and more varied than it would have been under the old system. The songbird story perfectly illustrates how quickly the unthinkable can become normal, and how the normal can become unthinkable. What seemed like common sense to one generation becomes criminal behaviour to the next, leaving us to wonder What foods we consider perfectly normal today might horrify our great-grandchildren. Here's a story that might truly astonish you, because it involves a food that wasn't just legal in Britain, but actively promoted by our own government well into the 1950s. I'm talking about whale meat on British dinner tables, served up with your Sunday vegetables and a cup of tea. During the Second World War, when rationing made every scrap of protein precious beyond measure, whale meat became an official part of the British diet. The Ministry of Food didn't just allow it, they actively encouraged families to serve it. Whale meat was distributed off ration, meaning you could buy it without surrendering those precious meat coupons that governed every other bit of beef or lamb. Picture your grandmother queuing at the local butcher's, not for a joint of beef or a leg of lamb, but for a thick steak carved from a creature that had been swimming in Antarctic waters just weeks before. The meat arrived in British shops in various forms, each with its own character and challenges. Fresh whale meat was the most striking, deep red, almost purple in colour, with a texture unlike anything else on the British table. The taste was intensely fishy, far stronger than any seafood most people had encountered. It wasn't subtle. This was meat that announced itself with every bite, carrying the essence of the deep ocean into suburban dining rooms across Britain. More popular with housewives was tinned whale meat, which could be stored for months in the pantry alongside the corned beef and spam. The tinning process mellowed the intense flavour somewhat, making it more palatable for families unaccustomed to such exotic fare. These tins became as familiar as any other wartime staple, stacked on kitchen shelves from Scotland to Cornwall. The preparation required genuine skill because whale meat was incredibly lean. Unlike beef or pork, which carried their own fat for flavour and moisture, whale meat would turn tough as leather if overcooked. Experienced cooks learned to treat it more like game than traditional meat, using careful timing and added fats to keep it tender. What's remarkable is how thoroughly the government promoted this unusual protein source. Cookbooks published during the war included whale meat recipes alongside traditional British dishes. The Ministry of Food produced leaflets explaining how to prepare it properly, treating whale steaks as naturally as they might discuss preparing a Sunday roast. The government's enthusiasm for whale meat didn't end when the war did. Well into the 1950s, you could still find whale meat in British shops, though it was increasingly seen as a wartime relic that families were happy to leave behind. The taste never quite caught on with the British palate in the way that spam or corned beef did. The meat came primarily from massive whaling operations in the Antarctic, where factory ships processed entire whales at sea before sending the products back to Britain. These operations were industrial in scale, turning the largest creatures on Earth into tins that sat on ordinary kitchen shelves. But the tide was turning against whaling long before most people realised it. The International Whaling Commission's moratorium on commercial whaling, which came into effect in 1986, effectively ended whale meat's presence in the British food supply. What had once been government policy became international conservation priority. Today, whale meat is completely illegal to import, sell or consume in Britain. The transformation was absolute, from ministry-approved protein to banned substance in just a few decades. A butcher caught selling whale meat today would face unlimited fines and possible imprisonment. The whale meat story represents something profound about how quickly our relationship with food can change. What seemed practical and patriotic to wartime families, making use of every available protein source, now seems almost barbaric to modern sensibilities. For those who remember those tinned whale steaks, the memory carries a particular weight. It represents not just a different approach to food, but an entirely different world where survival trumped sentiment and where the government's advice about dinner could include creatures from the furthest reaches of the ocean. The complete reversal from promotion to prohibition happened within living memory, making whale meat perhaps the most dramatic example of how thoroughly our food laws and attitudes can transform. Now we venture into rather uncomfortable territory, but it's important to address because the legal landscape around companion animals has changed quite dramatically, even if the cultural taboos were already firmly established by the 1920s. Dog and cat meats were never part of traditional British cuisine. Let's be absolutely clear about that. Britain has always regarded dogs and cats as companions rather than livestock, unlike some other cultures around the world. However, the legal prohibitions against consuming them are surprisingly recent, and the way these laws work might surprise you. In the 1920s, there was no specific law preventing someone from slaughtering and eating a dog or cat, though the practice would have been socially abhorrent. The cultural resistance was already there, but the legal framework simply didn't exist because it wasn't considered necessary. British society had already decided these animals belonged in the home, not on the dinner table. The change came with modern animal welfare legislation, particularly the Animal Welfare Act of 2006 and the Welfare of Animals at Time of Killing Regulations of 2015. Rather than explicitly stating "thou shalt not eat dogs," the legislation creates practical impossibilities that amount to the same thing. To legally slaughter any animal for food in modern Britain, you need licensed facilities, trained operators, veterinary inspection, and compliance with strict welfare standards. Since no such infrastructure exists for companion animals, dog and cat consumption becomes illegal by default. It's a clever bit of legislative drafting that achieves the desired result without having to spell out the obvious. But here's where things become rather more nuanced, because unlike our other examples, horse meat occupies a peculiar grey area in British law that might genuinely surprise you. Technically speaking, eating horse meat isn't illegal in Britain today. There's no law that specifically prohibits the consumption of equine flesh. However, the practical reality is so restrictive that horse meat has effectively vanished from the British food supply, creating what lawyers might call a distinction without a difference. Back in the 1920s, horse meat had a complicated reputation in Britain. Unlike in France or Belgium, where horse butchers operated openly, Britain had already developed cultural resistance to what the French call hippophagy, the consumption of horse flesh. The British love affair with horses, as noble creatures, was already well established. However, horse meat wasn't entirely absent from the British food chain. Knackers' yards, which dealt with dead and dying horses, sometimes sold horse meat for human consumption, though it was often disguised or sold without clear labelling. The practice existed in the shadows, neither fully accepted nor completely prohibited. The modern situation is fascinating in its complexity. While not explicitly banned, horse meat faces overwhelming practical obstacles that make it virtually impossible to obtain legally. Most significantly, horses in Britain are routinely treated with veterinary medicines like phenylbutazone, known as bute, that make them completely unsuitable for human consumption. These medications don't leave the horse's system quickly enough to make the meat safe for human consumption. Since virtually every horse in Britain receives veterinary treatment, at some point, finding a horse that would be safe to eat becomes nearly impossible. The result is that while you wouldn't technically be breaking any law by eating horse meat in Britain today, finding legal safe horse meat is virtually impossible. It's a perfect example of how regulatory obstacles can be more effective than outright bans. This creates an interesting contrast between different types of prohibition. Some foods are explicitly banned. You cannot legally consume whale meat under any circumstances. Others, like horse meat, exist in regulatory limbo, where they're theoretically legal, but practically impossible to obtain safely and legally. The companion animal story illustrates how our legal system has evolved to reflect cultural values that were already established. Sometimes the law follows society rather than leading it, creating formal structures around informal taboos that had existed for generations. Now let's talk about something that might be sitting in your local corner shop right now, but shouldn't be there legally. We're moving from the grand sweep of historical change to something far more immediate and perhaps more shocking, the sweets that modern Britain has deemed too dangerous for consumption. Take Jolly Ranchers, those brightly coloured American hard candies that seem harmless enough. Just sugar and flavouring, surely. The reality is far more complex. These popular sweets have been found to contain mineral oil additives that are completely banned in UK confectionery. Mineral oil raises serious health concerns, particularly regarding potential contamination with harmful substances and possible cancer-causing effects. The problem lies in the different regulatory standards between America and Britain. What's considered acceptable across the Atlantic doesn't necessarily meet our safety requirements. While these colourful, appealing sweets are marketed to children in America, UK regulators have deemed the substances they contain potentially harmful enough to ban them outright. Enforcement can be patchy though, and you might still find them being sold illegally in some shops, particularly those specialising in American imports. It creates a confusing situation where familiar international brands exist in different formulations depending on local regulations. Another American confectionery staple that's fallen foul of British food safety regulations is Twizzlers, particularly the Rainbow Twist variety. These chewy, brightly coloured licorice-style sweets contain unauthorised additives that put them firmly on the wrong side of UK law. The specific concern centres around artificial colourings that haven't been approved for use in British confectionery, including substances that have been linked to hyperactivity in children. Even something as seemingly innocent as a soft drink can become contraband. Fanta Pineapple, specifically the imported American version, contains various E numbers that are banned or restricted in British soft drinks. These include artificial colourings and preservatives that regulators believe pose unnecessary health risks, particularly to children who are the primary consumers of brightly coloured fizzy drinks. This creates the curious situation where Fanta, a brand owned by Coca-Cola and available worldwide, exists in different formulations depending on local regulations. The Fanta Pineapple you might buy in Florida is chemically different from any legally sold in Britain, reflecting our stricter European approach to food additives. These modern examples highlight a fundamental difference in regulatory philosophy. Britain follows the precautionary principle. If there's any reasonable doubt about safety, particularly for children, the substance gets banned. America tends toward an acceptable risk approach, where substances are permitted unless proven definitively harmful. But perhaps the most dramatic transformation from delicacy to dangerous contraband came with the BSE crisis of the 1980s and 1990s. Overnight, organ meats that had been expensive delicacies became absolutely forbidden. Beef kidneys, once the pride of steak and kidney pie, became classified as specified risk materials. Calf brains, previously served fried with black butter in fine restaurants, vanished entirely from British menus. The BSE crisis created some of the most comprehensive food bans in British history, transforming ingredients that had been culinary staples for centuries into substances so dangerous that possessing them became illegal. Our great-grandparents lived in a completely different food world, where whale steaks were government approved and songbird pie was Sunday dinner. What seemed perfectly normal then would horrify us now, just as our processed foods and chemical additives might appall them. These dramatic changes remind us that our relationship with food is never fixed. Today's delicacy might be tomorrow's contraband, and today's banned substance might once have been considered essential nutrition. Share your memories of family stories about unusual foods in the comments below, and subscribe for more trips down Britain's culinary memory lane.